Okay, so let me start. So I want to start by welcoming everybody. My name is Julio Guato. I am a member of the editorial board and also the manuscript collective of Science and Society. And this is a Science and Society online speaker series event. Science and Society is the journal of Marxist scholarship in the English-speaking world that has the longest publication record in history, 80 plus years, 84, 85 years. We can be found at scienceandsociety.com, also at JSTOR and social media. This evening, our featured speaker is Walden Bello, who will speak to us about China today. Dr. Bello teaches sociology at the State University of New York, Binghamton, upstate. He retired as a full professor at the University of Philippines and served in the House of Representatives of his country from 2009 to 2015, where he was the chair of the Committee on Overseas Workers' Affairs. He's co-founder and now is one of the chairs of the Institute focused on the Global South that is based in Bangkok, Thailand. He's authored dozens of books. The most recent ones related to China are Paper Dragons, China and the Next Crash, published by Bloomsbury in London. And also China and Imperial Power in the Image of the West, ? That's published by Focus on the Global South. Both of these books were out in 2019. Walden Bello received a doctoral degree in sociology, I believe, at Princeton University in 1975. And he's received many awards for his scholarship and political activity, including the Right Livelihood Award, or also known as the Alternative Nobel Prize in Stockholm, Sweden in 2003. And he's currently the national chairman of the Socialist Coalition, People's Struggle in the Philippines. So here's Walden Bello.
Yes, thank you, Julio, for inviting me to this series. And I'm very happy to be joining you from Manila. And it's morning here. And I made a bit of a miscalculation on hours. So because I've been on Zoom a number of times, and the different time zones really begin to confuse you. But in any event, I decided that I would just give some sort of an oral presentation, and maybe after that we could have questions regarding China. Okay, my interest in China has not been from an academic perspective. My interest in China has been from a more political perspective. And specifically, I have been engaged with China in two ways, mainly in two ways. One is when I was in the House of Representatives of the Congress of the Philippines. I was looking very closely at China's moves in the South China Sea. And I led a mission to the islands held by the Philippines, which was a mission that was greatly protested by the government of China. And then I authored a resolution in the House that was adopted by the Philippine government, the Department of Foreign Affairs, renaming the South China Sea the West Philippine Sea. As you know, that did not sink very well in Beijing. The second way that I have been engaged is Focus on the Global South. Was asked a number of times to try to figure out whether China was an imperial or imperialist power in the same way as the United States and Britain and previous imperial powers. And it's in this sense that I had to do fairly thorough work on China's recent history. And came, probably given my political record on the West Philippine Sea, to a surprising conclusion that no, I did not think China was an imperial power in the image of the West. Although if certain tendencies congealed, then that might become a reality. But certainly those who have been quick to equate China with the US as an imperial power, I think make a very great mistake. So let me then begin. Having given those two caveats, let me just begin. So the swift rise of China to the summit of the global political economy, or the near summit, you might say, stemmed from two crises in the 1970s, which were unrelated. One was the crisis of profitability of US capitalism, and the second was the crisis of legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party. The crisis of profitability of US capitalism was at the time expressed in the term stagflation. And the most likely causes of this were a chain of developments stemming from overaccumulation, more intense competition among global capitalist powers, and cost push inflation in the United States as capital and labor struggled over, a diminishing profitability. And when it came to China, it was the crisis of legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party stemmed from the very great social effects of the Chinese Cultural Revolution, which was, as everyone knows, led by Mao in an effort to deepen the Chinese Revolution. But in any event, the situation was a very divided society, a very divided party, and with Deng Xiaoping coming to power a second time, there was this consensus that was achieved that it was time to have a measure of stability that would be undergirded by economic growth. And that was sort of the process which started in the countryside and then led to the reform in the cities of state-owned enterprises. And finally, in the mid-1980s, an opening to foreign investment that was led by overseas Chinese capital, and US capital jumped in a big way in the early 1990s. And why did US capital jump in a big way? Despite the fact, that one of the escape routes that it was engaging in from the crisis of profitability was to transfer a lot of the labor-intensive economic processes to developing countries, like, for instance, to use the term developing country, or countries of the global south, like Mexico, Central America, Southeast Asia, Korea. Well, I think that China was really special, okay, and it was special because of the reservoir of cheap labor that it had, you know, which was incomparable compared to that offered by countries that had already been integrated into global capitalism, like the Philippines and like Mexico, where there were already strong tendencies to equalize wage rates because of their long integration into the global capitalist system. On the other hand, China had, you know, this vast pool of cheap labor that was, first of all, it was relatively not as susceptible to the equalization of wage rates in the global capitalist economy because of the relative closeness of the Chinese economy. And secondly, you had a strong, a large rural labor pool, a pool of rural labor that continually was releasing migrants to the cities, and thereby acting as a check on the rise of wages in the urban areas. So in this sense, then, China was very different, okay? And I think that very helpful in terms of understanding the role of China was Rosa Luxemburg's theory of imperialism. And let me just briefly read from her book, The Accumulation of Capital, because I think this is a very important source of understanding for us. So in her book, The Accumulation of Capital, Luxemburg wrote that a central dynamic of capitalism is to integrate pre-capitalist or non-capitalist areas of the world for three reasons. One, to acquire sources of raw materials for industry. Second, to serve as markets to absorb surplus production from the central capitalist economies. And third, to access cheap labor to counter rising cost of labor in the central economies. And of the three, the third is the most critical, since it is labor power that is the source of surplus value, of profits. Let me quote, "The existence and development of capitalism requires an environment of non-capitalist forms of production," unquote. Luxemburg writes, and I quote, "Capitalism needs non-capitalist social strata as a market for its surplus value, as a source of supply for its means of production, and as a reservoir of labor power for its wage system," unquote. So capitalism is imperial by nature. It cannot let other modes of production coexist with it because their destruction is necessary for its survival. And let me just have a long quote from her. "Capital needs other races to exploit territories where the white man cannot work, It must be able to mobilize world labor without restriction in order to utilize productive forces of the globe, up to the limits imposed by a system of producing surplus value. This labor power, however, is in most cases rigidly bound by the traditional pre-capitalist organization of production. It must be, quote unquote, set free in order to be enrolled in the active army of capital. The emancipation of labor power from primitive social conditions and its absorption by the capitalist wage labor system is one of the indispensable historical basis of capitalism. Obtaining the necessary labor from non-capitalist societies, the so-called labor problem is ever more important for capital. All possible methods of quote unquote gentle compulsion are applied to transfer labor from former social systems to the command of capital, unquote. So that is, from the accumulation of capital that uh, uh, authored by Rosa Luxembourg. Now, uh, China's relatively smooth integration into the global economy owed much to its timing. First, it appeared on the scene as US corporate elite was tearing up its informal social contract with US labor centered on on stably rising wages, uh, the so-called three glorious decades social contract from the late 40s to the late 70s. Secondly, its emergence coincided with the development of the corporate value chain and the technology of containerization, which was quite revolutionary um, in terms of compressing time and distance. Third, Beijing benefited from its incorporation into the newly established World Trade Organization, which meant, among other things, that unlike the Western countries in their ascent as trading powers, it did not have to fight for global markets, that is, fight with force. Uh, and I think this is a very big difference between the ascent of previous capitalist powers and China, the absence of violence and force in its struggle for global markets. Um, although the United States uh, uh, expected, that because of the competitiveness of its corporations, as they saw it, China was in fact or emerged as the greatest beneficiary of globalization. So um, China's ascendancy has involved not only gaining markets for its goods in the global north, but also gaining raw materials and food, as well as markets in the global south. While there have been abuses on the part of its state-owned corporations and private capitalists, which Alvin Kamba calls flexible capitalists, China is still, for the most part, not perceived as an imperial power in the image of the West. The Belt and Road Initiative is an ambitious program that will span Eurasia and incorporate many regions in the global south. But in my view, it is not really a blueprint for Chinese domination. It is instead driven by Beijing's effort to export its surplus industrial capacity, which is a very big problem at this point in time, a problem which is miring many of its state enterprises in debt. And indeed, many Chinese economists, see the BRI as not not a blueprint for domination, nor is it seen as altruism on the part of China, but they do feel, that the overcapacity of large sectors of Chinese industry has been very ruinous in terms of profitability, and has led to greater and greater debt on the part of state-owned enterprises. And that expanding outwards in terms of providing infrastructural projects, loans to support that in many parts of the global South, has been an effort to counteract and to resolve eventually the overcapacity problem. So there are many aspects of the BRI that we can probably deal with later on. But the BRI, or the Belt and Road Initiative, basically started as sort of two routes, that were sort of taken from the fabled Silk routes from China to the West in the early modern era. It began as sort of the overland route, the old Silk route, and then there was the maritime route. But in the last few years, BRI has exploded to cover so many different routes. In terms of the China's opening to the globe, to the point that there is now even a polar Silk route. Okay, and I don't think this can be understood without taking into consideration domestic politics in China, especially the relations among provinces and the relations of the provinces to the center. And that also must take into consideration, the way that consensus is built up within the Chinese Communist Party, where the BRI has been legitimized domestically as a win-win solution for all factions. Okay, and then there has also been the global leadership dimension, that BRI may not be a blueprint for Chinese domination, but certainly performs a very great role in terms of Chinese leadership in the global economy, which we saw, especially when Trump in 2017 was basically saying, now, it's going to be America first, and basically blaming US allies for taking advantage of it. During the Davos meeting in 2017, in late January, Xi Jinping went to Davos and filled what was then seen as a vacuum of leadership that was being vacated, created by the Trump withdrawal. And one of the things that he championed at Davos was that the Belt and Road Initiative, which by that time was already costing over $3 trillion, was something that China had to offer the world. That it had, that this was sort of China's contribution to globalization, and indeed, that China had now become, it was making a bid to be the leader of the process of globalization. So China is experiencing problems. There is, of course, the very well-known environmental problems. There is the growth in inequality, which is now seen as one of the rate of inequality in China is now one of the highest in the world. And this also includes, of course, gender inequalities. There is, of course, the problem of overcapacity. There is, the problem of technology. That although China has been successful in getting U.S. corporations to transfer technology, there's still a lot that needs to be transferred and to be converted into self-sustaining technological development. Now, so these are problems. And however, compared, I would say that these are problems associated with rapid growth. And I would say that, this kind of problems of growth, grave though they may be, are very different from those being faced by the United States at this point, which are problems associated with decline. Okay, definitely the United States is still, the world's #1 global capitalist power, and China's economy is linked with it, in many ways at the productive level, at the level of, finance, and at the level of trade, okay? But I would say, though, that other challengers to the global domination of hegemons in the past were also quite integrated into the hegemon's economy. Just recently, of course, here is, that Germany is integrated into the global trading system. That was then led by Great Britain, did not prevent it from, in fact, challenging the British for hegemony. And this was, of course, Germany at the turn of the 20th century. And neither did the hegemony of the United Kingdom. That did not deter, although the U.S. was very much integrated in terms of trade and capital with British capital. That did not prevent the United States from mounting a challenge, which was, successful. Okay, but let me say that coming back to this point about China's experiencing problems associated with growth, being very different from those of the United States experiencing problems associated with decline. Okay, and I think the industrialization, which has been partly occasioned by China, has spawned class resentments, but these have been channeled into racial anger, creating a dangerously polarized society. There has also been inward turning, a new isolationism that cuts across political cleavages. So let me just spend, a few more sentences on this. I think it cannot be denied, that the deindustrialization that was caused by by U.S. corporations moving many of their labor-intensive processes to China has been a significant cause of, the um, um, polarization in the United States. Now, that has not been, of course, the only cause. There has also been the financialization of the economy. There has also been the restructuring of income, of redistributing it from the rich, from the middle class and the poor, to the rich, through changes in the tax law since the Reagan period. But I think that in terms of deindustrialization, I think that its impact has really been, very, very important. I think that the most conservative estimate, of how many jobs were lost to China was one by the National Bureau of Economic Research. I believe it said something like 2.1 million jobs. There have been higher estimates, of course. Okay. Now, one further word here. What we have in the United States at this point is not just an economic crisis. I think it's really a very, very deep political crisis and a very deep ideological crisis. And I, I think that maybe this is really what is dominant, even above the economic aspects of the crisis, is really the very polarized political and ideological crisis in the United States at this point, which has very, very, very deep roots. It is, as we've seen, white supremacy has practically become the ideology of the Republican Party. And you have a class and ideological polarization that goes from top to bottom. So the what you have is a two-party system in the United States, that is irretrievably polarized at this point in time, and certainly that is going to have some impact in terms of the economy. China, on the other hand, is not experiencing political polarization, there being no significant opposition to communist rule. Now, of course, there are brave human rights and democratic rights activists that continue to resist the monolithic rule of the Communist Party, but I think they are far and few between. Okay, certainly there is a lot of dissatisfaction that is expressed on the internet, but I think that in terms of becoming some sort of cohesive opposition, that dissatisfaction has not led, to this becoming a cohesive opposition, and a lot of it is really local in character. And while there is definitely a lot of localized struggles, it has not become sort of large cross country organized, opposition. And I would just like to say that, there are a lot of protests in China, because sometimes this is something that is not appreciated. There are a lot of working class protests. There are a lot of farmers' protests against land, that was being expropriated by local authorities. Environmental protests, and in fact, at around 2008 or 2010, the state used to keep a tally of protests, and they were increasing every year until around 2010. The government no longer kept a tally of protests, but I think we can be assured that there are protests still that are happening, and that there are many. But as I said earlier, these are localized protests. They have not become systemic opposition. So there are other things that we need to take into consideration here. That Xi Jinping has identified the ideological as the central factor. That is, basically, he says that it is when a society begins to be incoherent ideologically, that decline begins. And I think that he has launched two major efforts in this regard. First of all, for several years now, there has been an aggressive anti-corruption campaign. And this has been Xi's response to popular alienation from the party. And this aggressive anti-corruption campaign has netted people across the board, party officials across the board, including from Xi's base in eastern and southeastern China. Of course, people also say that this has been a way by which he's rooting out his rivals, and maybe that is, probably correct. But nevertheless, I think there is a universal sense that this is a fairly serious anti-corruption drive in comparison with others. Xi has also been leading in terms of ideological consolidation or ideological reconstruction. And he has taken the lead in formulating an ideology centered on achieving the Chinese dream, which is, I think, that of providing decent levels of living for most Chinese by, the next few decades, for all to be able to enjoy that. And of course, the name Chinese Dream is something that is very interesting, in that he was using, the words, usually used by the United States, the American dream. And the second pillar of that ideology has been national rejuvenation, the rejuvenation of the Chinese civilization that has finally emerged from its 19th and early 20th century time of troubles, and finally is ready to take its place in the in terms of global leadership. Okay, So, of course, part of this ideological reconstruction at the international level, I have already mentioned, has been to take on the banner of China being the leader of globalization and moving it to its next phase of what he called connectivity via the Bretton Woods, by the Belt and Road Initiative. Okay, and even as the US-centered multilateral system, composed principally of the IMF, the World Bank, and the WTO, is generating widespread alienation among governments in the global south, or as in the case of the WTO, it is suffering from unilateralist actions. China has helped to create or led in the creation of an incipient alternative multilateral system, though it has moved cautiously in this direction. And let me just briefly say what these moves are. So in any event, I think we all know that as a political canopy for US-led globalization, the IMF, the World Bank, and the WTO have been fairly important. But ever since the 2008 financial crisis, the IMF has been associated with the imposition of austerity programs, not only in the global south, but also in Europe. The World Bank is really suffering an ideological crisis, which, because it took so much of the leadership in terms of promoting neoliberalism, now that neoliberalism has not delivered, even some of its economists, like Paul Collier, for instance, who headed up the World Bank Research Department during the key period in the early 2000s, have issued mea culpas about having led in promoting neoliberalism. And of course, with respect to the WTO, ever since 2003, the US has practically given up on the WTO as a mechanism for global trade liberalization. And as the Bretton Woods system faltered, China was in the process of participating in creating an incipient alternative multilateral system. And I will just mention 4 key institutions set up in this regard: the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the AIIB, the New Development Bank, which is taken along with the BRICS, the Contingent Reserve Arrangement, also BRICS initiative, and the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. This is the latest, the RCEP. The RCEP, which was formed formally in December of 2020, brings together 10 members of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, with China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand in the world's biggest free trade bloc. Okay. Now, while some have interpreted these moves as China's efforts to supplant the US-dominated multilateral system, Beijing has moved carefully in these initiatives, like it has moved carefully on the matter of promoting the renminbi as a reserve currency. In fact, any talk that this would supplant the current multilateral system is discouraged by China, mainly because it does not want to be the subject of inflated expectations that can lead to disillusionment later on, if it is perceived as in fact offering an alternative to the United States. So rather than being displaced or taken over by the Chinese, the Bretton Woods institutions are likely to just limp along, providing some ideological competition to the Chinese by promoting a private enterprise-led as opposed to a state-led path of development, but unable to compete with them when it comes to resources. What is clear is that when it comes to borrowing money or seeking developmental aid, more and more countries in the global south are beating a path to Beijing than to the IMF and World Bank headquarters in Washington, DC. Now, let me then move on to the last, but I think the most important part of this talk. And that is the strategic competition between the United States and China. And just a second, please. Okay. Okay, just give me a few seconds here because this has been, I believe. Okay. Well, let me just, I'm trying to find this. Let me just go into strategic competition. And I was, as I said, this I think is the most important topic in this seminar. Okay, so so if there is one area where the United States still enjoys an overwhelming advantage over China, it is on the strategic front. So in his speech at the 19th National Congress of the Communist Party on October 18, 2017, the famous Chinese Dream speech, Xi Jinping laid out a three-stage schedule for China's military modernization, ending at mid-century with the achievement of the military, of having been turned into quote unquote world-class forces that could quote manage crisis and win wars. One can read that assertion as Xi's admission that the People's Liberation Army was 30 years behind the US military, universally regarded as the world-class standard. So since the 1990s, the Pentagon has sounded warnings that China was set to become the US strategic rival. Its concerns were, however, always placed secondary to the priority of Washington's political and business elites to integrate China into the global economy. With Trump's accession to power, however, China was defined not only as a competitor, but as an antagonistic competitor. As the landmark National Security Strategy paper put it, and let me just find that that one. Okay. China seeks to displace the United States in the Indo-Pacific region. I'm quoting now. Expand the reaches of its state-driven model and reorder the region in its favor. For decades, US policy was rooted in the belief that support for China's rise and for its integration into the post-war international order would liberalize China. Contrary to our hopes, China expanded its power at the expense of the sovereignty of others. China gathers and exploits data on an unrivaled scale and spreads features of its authoritarian system, including corruption and the use of surveillance. It is building the most capable and well-funded military in the world, after our own. Its nuclear arsenal is growing and diversifying. Part of China's military modernization and economic expansion is due to its access to US innovation economy, including America's world-class universities. Um, as the US civilian elites engage in what has become unrestricted political warfare among themselves, making even a modicum of consensus impossible in most areas, as many of you, of course, experience, there is one area where both liberal and conservative elites coincide, indeed, compete to proclaim their adherence to, and that is to maintain overwhelming military edge of the US state. Also, it's impossible that as the civilian elites exhaust themselves in fratricidal strife on domestic issues, the military would take a more and more active role in defining the US overall direction. So how do the United States and China's armed forces compare today? Okay. Well, in 2019, for which the latest figures are available, US military expenditures were about 3 times those of China, $732 billion to $261 billion. The rise in military spending by the United States was 5.3% from its level in 2018, while that of China's was 5.1%. Okay. US officials now routinely describe China as, quote unquote, a near peer competitor. This is grossly inaccurate if we use nonpartisan indicators. First of all, in terms of nuclear weapons, Beijing has a relative small nuclear force that is guided by a no first use doctrine, NFU, focused on deterring a potential aggressor via the maintenance of a second strike retaliatory capability. The United States has vastly superior nuclear capabilities, and it has not adopted an NFU position. China has only about 216 nuclear warheads, while at the end of 2017, the United States nuclear arsenal contained approximately just under 1,400 deployed and approximately 4,000 stockpiled warheads. Secondly, China's conventional offensive capabilities are grossly inferior to that of the United States. Now, 2 key indicators of a country's offensive capability are its overseas bases and its aircraft carriers. China has only 1 overseas military base, and that is located in Djibouti off the Gulf of Aden, from which it participates in anti-piracy activities. Now, the United States has scores of military bases surrounding China, 25 major bases and 60 other facilities spread all over Japan, 15 bases in South Korea, 3 bases in Guam, and 5 bases in the Philippines. In terms of aircraft carriers, China has only 2 operational carriers with an antiquated Soviet-era design. I mean, we're talking about 40 years back. While the United States has 11 carrier task forces, one of them, the 7th Fleet, based in the East Yokosuka, Japan, which can easily be supplemented by another carrier force from the Eastern Pacific in the event of conflict. US carriers like the recently commissioned USS Gerald Ford are the state of the art, far in advance of anything China has to offer. Even the Pentagon describes China's strategic posture as strategic defense, which is, quote, and I'm quoting the Pentagon now, is rooted in a commitment not to initiate armed conflict, but to respond robustly if an adversary challenges China's national security, unity, territorial sovereignty, or interests. The US strategic posture, on the other hand, is offensive. It has 3 key components. One is forward deployment, and that is to push the presence of US military power as far as possible from the territorial limits of the United States and as near as possible to the borders of a likely enemy. Second is a war-fighting strategy called air-sea doctrine. And a key document explicitly points to China as the enemy. And it calls for, and I'm quoting now from this Pentagon doctrine, kinetic and non-kinetic, in other words, both explosive and electronic strikes against inland command centers, radar systems, and intelligence gathering facilities, raids against missile production and storage operations, and blinding operations against Chinese satellites. It also says that China's, quote, seaborne trade flows would be cut off, with an eye toward exerting major stress on the Chinese economy and eventually internal stress, unquote. Third, the US long-term strategic perspective is called overmatch. According to Mike Clear, and I quote, although reminiscent of containment in some respects, overmatch differs from Cold War strategy not only because it presumes two and possibly more major competitors instead of just one, but also because it requires a perpetual struggle for dominance in every realm, including in trade, energy, and technology. I guess what this means is that China is condemned to a perpetual catch-up race because once it has hit certain benchmarks where the United States was, for instance, just a while ago, the United States has already moved beyond those benchmarks. Now, China's strategic dilemma is that large parts of the US military forces in the Western Pacific lie right on its doorstep, entrenched in bases in the so-called First Island chain, or at sea in the forward deployed US 7th Fleet. Most of China's industrial infrastructure and population are located in the country's southeastern and eastern coasts, and thus very vulnerable to US power in the event of conflict. Now, China's response has been to move its defenses outwards, placing anti-access, anti-denial weapons, A2AD, in maritime formations it seized in the South China Sea from countries like the Philippines. These moves have been justified unilaterally by saying that 90% of the South China Sea belong to China. China's claim to 90% of the South China Sea, needless to say, is illegal and violates the rights of 500 countries that border that body of water. But from a strategic point of view, which is our concern at this moment, it is understandable. So the US-China jockeying for power in the South China Sea is creating a very explosive situation since there are no rules of the game except an informal balance of power. And as we all know, resorting to balance of power as a regulator of conflict in the European case was resulted in the First World War. Right now, US and Chinese ships are engaged in provocative games of chicken in which jet fighters bust enemy ships, quote unquote, or warships head for their rivals, then swerve at the last minute. Now, these have been documented, and just think about the undocumented instances in which this is happening. At this moment in time. When I visited Vietnam in 2015 as a member of a parliamentary mission, the Vietnamese were very worried, that a ship collision, because precisely of the lack of rules of the game, can easily escalate into a higher form of warfare. So, I would say that in terms of the potential for things breaking out into armed conflict, the South China Sea or West Philippine Sea has the greatest potential at this moment in time. Okay, so Clausewitz famously wrote that, quote, war is the extension of politics by other means, unquote. Now, this gives too much weight to rational calculus as a process of determining when to go to war. it grossly underestimates the role of what I would call passion. But what is truly dangerous is when passion is joined to rational calculus, such as when the desire to maintain hegemony is attached to a calculable process of when to go to war. Xi Jinping's published estimate at the 19th Congress that it will only be in the mid-century that China will have quote unquote world-class forces that can match those of the United States has perhaps unwittingly on his part given the Pentagon a sense that it has a 30-year window of opportunity and maybe even less to prevent that from happening. Now, in one of his recent book, Graham Allison, who is regarded as, by the strategic study establishment in the United States as the quote unquote dean, has this very interesting sentence where he said, that China and the United States are on a collision course to war. This is in his book, I think Destined for Conflict or something, the title is. Now, I think Allison probably is channeling thinking within the Pentagon that he is closely associated with. And if you look very closely at this book, he gives fairly detailed descriptions of various scenarios by which the United States can react to China, including a scenario of destabilization, combining coercive military means and political means. Okay, and it's a fairly detailed prescription, although he says that there are various scenarios. This scenario, too, I believe, is, in my reading, a destabilization process is what he really thinks should be adopted by the United States. So let me just end by saying that there are, of course, arguments around whether China is an expansionist power. I will not go into those at this point in time. My own opinion is that when it resorts to force, it is mainly for defensive reasons. And even the Pentagon recognizes that. The last time that China was engaged in a shooting war was, I believe, during the invasion to teach Vietnam a lesson back in the late 70s. So we're talking about the fact that China has now not been engaged in a shooting war, except, of course, border disputes with India. That's over the last few years, but those are sort of border disputes. But the United States has been, constantly at war for the last 20 years, and for most of the several years before that, So, so basically, I think this gives many of us who have experienced the fact that the United States is a bellicose power, and that it is never wise to underestimate the bellicosity of the United States. There is great grounds for concern, that as the United States feels that it is losing the edge in many other areas, but it has uncontested military superiority, it would be the height of folly to think, that the United States will not translate its military might uh, into a mechanism to uh, uh, reverse its comprehensive decline in other areas. So for me, the big question is not, in fact, whether the United States will or will not uh, use its military power against China. The question is when and how it is going to do that. Okay. Uh, as an activist here, as in the Philippines, which is on the front lines of this struggle between China and the United States in the South China Sea, I have proposed a four-step process of leading to the demilitarization and denuclearization of the South China Sea, that this is the best hope for the region. So far, that proposal has not been taken up, okay? I think China and the United States don't have an interest in adopting a multilateral diplomatic proposal at this point of this sort. But the longer that we have this unregulated balance of power, games of chicken, etc., happening in the South China Sea, the closer we are to the day when a conflict can break out, a conflict that can either be unintended or a conflict, that is engineered, just like the 1964 Tonkin Bay uh, um, conflict in when the United States used a so-called incident to be able to launch the air war against what was then North Vietnam. So let me thank you again, for letting me address the body here, and I was very happy to do so. And again, to Julio, thanks a lot for arranging this. And let me just say that I am, of course, a fan of science and society, but and I would really want to have at some point in time a free subscription to it. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Walden. Just hang on, because I'm sure the audience has questions for you. So anybody, I may start the questions if you don't mind. Kind of abusing my privilege here. So on the issue of overcapacity, Walden, the overcapacity, industrial overcapacity of China, let me kind of play the devil's advocate here and hear your take on it. What your response would be to that. Okay, so there are state-owned companies in China that are highly indebted, and that using the criteria of regular market private capitalist profitability, some of them may be deemed unviable in other countries, not in China. They are propped up by state-owned banks, or I think probably mainly by state-owned banks. So what is the problem with that? So these are state-owned industrial companies that owe money to state-owned banks in China. So it's all state-owned. So it's like the left pocket owes money to the right pocket. So that debt can be just evaporated, because it's like it can be just consolidated and slashed down. And if there is a higher priority, like strategic, political, industrial policy type of or foreign foreign affairs type of interest in maintaining those companies, why not maintaining them? I've heard the argument about the overcapacity of China and the over-indebtedness of the state-owned companies in China for decades. For decades, if you read, Wall Street Journal or any of those, Business Week, Bloomberg, there are commentators that have been anticipating the collapse of massive financial crisis in China as a result of this pyramid of debts that is apparently unsustainable. And yet that just hasn't happened because again, the reserve political capital of the Chinese Communist Party seems to be still, and it's curious how it intertwines with capitalist development, with the development of private capitalism, how that reinforces the legitimacy of the state, but at the same time, it grants legitimacy to a state that then uses that power, it uses that authority to rule over resources and kind of intervene in the economy massively. Through regulation and also through, the control that it has over banking and all that. So if this state-owned companies in China owe money to, they are indebted with foreign capital, I don't know to what extent they are, to be honest, but that thing, I think I forgot, but I had a counter argument against that as well. But I'm just going to stop here because I want to hear questions from the rest of the audience. But I want to hear your take on that.
Well, certainly, there is overcapacity in China that contributes, to a decline in the profitability or of its state-owned enterprises. But I'm not one of those who argues that this crisis is going to explode very soon. Precisely because of the reasons you mentioned, the day of reckoning can be postponed indefinitely. Okay, and basically the debts can just be rolled over and rolled over and rolled over because of what the Chinese Communist Party says. Okay, and basically what that is a political process. Okay, like if the state enterprises of province X are heavily in debt, then it is a matter of negotiation between provincial authorities and the central authorities. So that's. However, that doesn't mean that the central authorities no longer have an interest in those companies gaining a modicum of profitability. Okay, so because they know that that this can have consequences in the future that may not even be foreseen at this point in time if you just keep on rolling over the debts. So I think there is an interest in at least reducing the level of debt of these corporations, and that is why I think that the BRI, one of the BRI's main objectives has been really to export this surplus capacity in the hope, that the state enterprises can begin to become profitable. Okay, because of arrangements done with foreign governments. So basically at this point, as I would say, it's not a crisis that will explode fairly soon, but I think it is a process that can you can put off the day of reckoning for these state enterprises. But nevertheless, I think there is an interest on the part of the central government of saying, hey, we really have to, find a way to stop just rolling over your debts, So, and I think that is one of the that is one of the reasons that has pushed, the Belt and Road Initiative. And in fact, Chinese economists themselves admit, that this is a central reason for the BRI. They may not, they may, uh, whatever their views are on whether this is a blueprint for hegemony or this is altruism. There's one thing that these economists admit, that they have, it has something to do very much with the export of surplus or capacity or overcapacity. So
No,
I find myself in agreement with you.
Okay. I was going to say that with regards to assuming that those state-owned companies are indebted with foreign capital, I thought that the reserves, the foreign exchange reserves that China has are immense still now. So it doesn't seem like an urgent or any short run kind of problem. But yeah,
Well,
but I understand that it kind of sabotages the idea that you want to have the market discipline companies to some extent. You don't want them to be rescued by the state, and kind of foster corruption and all that. But the government of China seems to be pretty heavy-handed in terms of punishing, individual managers, individual executives. Unlike the United States, like after 2008, the bank, the financial panics, and how gentle the Obama government was with those bankers that make those momentous decisions that that led to the meltdown.
well, I think that, when it comes to China, just my sense is that they're less they're more lenient on economic managers than political managers. If one could really lose one's job in China as political, as the head of the county government, for instance, if the protests get out of hand, okay, or they go above a certain level, so there's a lot of toleration of workers' protests in China at this point in time, sort of kids' gloves, when it comes. But when they reach a certain level where we're talking about hundreds of people that are protesting, then the political managers at the county or the provincial level get very worried, because their jobs are on the line. Because the main thing that the Chinese government is very concerned about is that there is political stability, because the experience of how political instability created, so much problems in the past, the latest on that being the Cultural Revolution. So I think political managers are always on their toes, okay? And then they put the pressure on economic managers, and not to be too tough, when it comes to demanding, discipline or whatever, or opposing wage increases from workers, so because they know that their jobs are on the line. So I would say that there is this process by which the political managers get worried about their jobs. Therefore, they have to tell economic managers that you have to be more careful in terms of the way that you deal with the workforce. So this is what. So I guess China is yes, a capitalist state, but it's a capitalist state sui generis, so it's very hard to expect that it would behave in many of its ways with like the way other capitalist elites behave. Now, of course, some people would say that is, from one perspective, the fact that there's a greater management of crisis, the fact that there is a sensitivity to social issues, is one advantage of the Chinese model. Others would say, that this lack of being disciplined by market forces is a disadvantage, for from their point of view. So so there are those conflicting assessments of the role of political intervention in the dynamics of Chinese capitalism.
Thank you. We have two questions on the chat. So do you people want to read them yourselves, or you want me to read them? Jacqueline? You can unmute yourself, Jacqueline, if you need to. Okay, I'll read it. I'll read it out. It says, "What is your opinion of the 1996 super exploitation of the Chinese working class?"
Well, definitely, I think that this has that it has been exploitation. Some have in fact considered super exploitation, but I think okay, there were two big groups that were involved here. On the one hand, there was the Chinese Communist leadership, and on the other hand, there were the TNCs. And the deal was cheap labor. Okay. Now, from the TNC side, all they were interested in was exploitation or super exploitation in order to be able to reverse the decline in profitability. That was the main interest. The interest of the Chinese state, on the other hand, in allowing that to happen, was in order to be able to get TNCs and harness the TNCs to be able to comprehensively develop the Chinese economy. Basically, develop that in terms of growth. Develop that in terms of facilitating technology transfer, et cetera, et cetera. So there was a strategic objective there, which was, that okay, we'll allow this to happen at this point in time, okay, but once we have been able to to um, derive what the TNCs have to offer, that will be the time that the TNCs will be no longer be necessary for us, and we will have built up the capacity to be able to satisfy the needs of the majority of the population in terms of raising their incomes. So that's I think that was the perspective of the Chinese leadership in there. So they had a strategic perspective as opposed to the more short-termist perspective of the transnational corporations. Now, some people would say that in many areas of the Chinese economy, TNCs are now superfluous. Some would say that no, you still have TNCs, that especially big tech, that are important when it comes to technology transfer that has not yet been achieved. So there is that debate that is going on at this point in time. Now, I'm not, I'm not saying, that the sort of strategic view of the Chinese Communist Party was right or wrong ethically. All I'm trying to say is that that's the perspective that they had, and that differed very much from the very short-term exploitative perspective of TNC. So I'm just giving the two perspectives that came together, in a deal to exploit the Chinese working class back in the late 80s and 1990s.
Jan Herong, can Dr. Bello talk about what people and governments of the South should respond to the US-China rivalry? How should they respond to this rivalry?
Well, there have been even among those who are um, uh, uh, very favorable towards China, um, have been saying, that yes, there have been abuses on the part of Chinese state corporations in Africa. For instance, there's a big problem of, that Chinese corporations do not, give enough jobs to local people, but instead they bring over people from China. Uh, and there are um, big concerns that China is using 20th century top-down technology, which is very, very damaging to the environment. And in fact, people would say that that's the big problem with the BRI, that it's mainly infrastructure problems that create tremendous environmental problems. And uh, and I share those concerns. And my sense is that the best way to relate to China is in these areas is to be critical, to tell the Chinese that, look, you cannot just reproduce a Western imperial model. This is creating problems. And I think the stronger and the louder those voices make it are felt, there is less incentive on the part of the Chinese government to move in the traditional imperial ways. So that is my, and that's why, if people ask me this question, that's what I say. That the best way that you can really, really respond to China at this point in time, if you have criticisms, is to make your criticisms felt, because it will create disincentives in terms of the way that this follows the West, and that underlies another point that I think that was implicit in that, is that I don't think we can equate U.S. imperialism at this point with Chinese global expansion. I mean, there's so many differences in the way that this has taken place. And certainly, if you just look at markets, there's been hardly any use of force and coercion in the way that China has moved to be able to um, create markets. And the use of violence and force is something that characterized the rise of the British, the rise of the Dutch, the rise of the Spanish, and of course, the rise of the United States. So was it just a case of timing that, this was the height of neoliberal, hegemony, that created the WTO, and that China was integrated into the global capitalist economy at the very time that you had this idea about free trade that needs to be consolidated through free trade rules, and the WTO is the best engine for this. Yes, maybe that was part of it, but I think what we see now is that, in fact, um, uh, the creation of the WTO and China's joining it, um, created a situation whereby China was able to gain markets without the use of force, unlike uh, other countries. So I think that we must be very wary about false equations. And when China needs to be criticized, I think we really need to exercise our right to um, criticize. So that's really um, the best way I could respond to part of that question. As to uh, how does one respond to localized manifestations of the US-China rivalry, as in the West Philippine Sea or the South China Sea? And I think we really need to be able to promote peaceful solutions. In the case of the South China Sea, I think a sort of a multilateral agreement that brings the Association of Southeast Asian Countries together with China, sit at the table and create, a demilitarized zone or a denuclearized zone, which needs to be respected by third countries like the United States, and those multilateral negotiations still really have to take place. But I think China has in the past indicated it is open to that, but its practice has been to just work bilaterally with different governments. Um, so my sense is that a multilateral diplomatic solution based on demilitarization and denuclearization is the best way to avoid the kind of very dangerous situation you now have in the South China Sea. If there's going to be a point of conflict, as I said, from which the United States and China could come to blows, it is in this area. And that is why, as somebody from the Philippines, as part of Southeast Asia, this has been a special advocacy on my part to promote this demilitarization of the South China Sea.
Nana, what Dr. Bello think about the coronavirus pandemic? This is a very interesting question. What Dr. Bello think about the coronavirus pandemic will influence the future role of China in the world?
Okay, well, the coronavirus pandemic and China have had a very interesting relationship. As we all know, in the very beginning, everybody was blaming China for its officials not responding in an adequate way to the Wuhan epidemic the Wuhan situation, and then in the middle of the year, when China began to be able to control the coronavirus and reduce infections and deaths, then it became sort of, oh wow, China's been able to do it, and so that and now we have a third phase in which China is now delivering the vaccine, Sinovac and Sinopharm. It's delivering it to so many countries, especially in the global south, and making arrangements for local manufacture, while the United States and the big pharma are opposing the TRIPS waiver in the WTO, where they really don't want a waiver to be granted for local manufacturing of the vaccine. So, and we also have these different problems connected with the vaccines, in produced by Western pharmaceutical companies, in terms of being able to stop the new variants. And I don't think that I have heard problems emerge with respect to that, with respect to the Chinese vaccines, which are apparently produced in the more traditional way that vaccines are produced. So I think I think what you have now is, China will probably be able to reap a lot of goodwill from its vaccine diplomacy, and so so this is currently an active effort to gain a very good name in countries in the global south, especially in Africa at this point in time. So I think that so let me just put my answer at that.
Thank you. If you have a question, raise your hand or put it in the chat. So at this point, I have two questions. I think one by David Schwartzman from our editorial board, and then Lingyi Wei. So I'm going to read them out. Potentially, the global peace movement can work to prevent an armed conflict instigated by US imperialist aggression against China, but is there also a potential constraint against such an armed conflict as a result of transnational capital acting to protect its investment in both the US and China? So is there like transnational capital that has a vested interest on stability between these two?
Well, at this, yes, I mean, the possibilities of transnational capital creating its own security force, irrespective, of what the United States or China have, either protect them or not protect them, is always a possibility. And we saw that during the Bush period, with respect to Blackwater and other similar agencies that were used to protect, U.S. Projects in Iraq, for instance. Okay, and as I understand, China itself has had talks with Eric Prince. I believe he used to be the head of Blackwater, about protecting its personnel in developing countries in the global South against attack by quote unquote people that might be hostile to China. So my interpretation to that is I think that as far as Western capital is concerned, it's principally still the U.S. state that they rely on for both military as well as political protection. However, there has been this efforts to create, alternative security forces that we've seen in the case of Blackwater, that sort of thing. And also, of course, we still have capitalist states like France that, rely on their security forces to intervene when their interests are threatened. And this has happened in the case of Britain and France, where they feel that their security interests or economic interests are threatened. In Africa, they have resorted to, those kind of use of either state forces or, of course, mercenary forces. So that's the use of mercenaries instead of state forces. I think that is something that continues to be a continuing threat to countries in the global South on the part of corporations or capitalist states that have strong investments in their area.
Okay, so we have two questions in the chat, and then we have Shunshu who raised his hand. So we're gonna close now the questions and answers. So just these three ones. So let me read Lingyi Wei, and then Shunshu, and then Russell Dale. I'll read it out, or maybe Russell can read it himself. From Lingyi, mainly because of costly property, education, and medication, young generation of Chinese are less willing to raise children. What do you think of China's below replacement fertility, and also the potential impact of low fertility trap?
Well, I think that this is a problem. This is in many ways something that is regarded as a problem, but in other well, let me put it this way. I think that I think there have been a series of articles recently, that have like in the New York Times. I believe this was just recent, a couple of months ago, where they say that this has had an impact in terms of the raising of children, and that this is something that the Communist Party that used to have a fairly egalitarian view on the relationships among the genders, the men and women, that it has begun to express how women, should take a more active role in caring for children. Okay, and I think that many women in China have begun to worry that this new emphasis on women being the one that should principally take care of childcare is something that is going to translate into a reversal of what has been achieved by Chinese women. Uh, I think the um, uh, the below replacement fertility question, um, uh, I think it has going to have an impact in terms of uh, uh, more technology intensive production processes being developed. I think this is going to have an impact in terms of the development of robotics in China, for instance. So um, I think that you also have a situation whereby um, you will have um, workers see that their capacity to bargain with respect to the managers, to the CCP, will be increased precisely because of these trends, in terms of the absence of a sort of low wage reserve army of labor, which is practically absent at this point in time in China. That ought to translate into a greater respect for workers' demands or workers' rights. So it has a number of very interesting implications, both good and bad, in my view. And there are others. I don't think we can go into that to a great extent at this point in time. But what we need to realize is that there are other countries that surrounding China that are experiencing, this low fertility trap. There is, for instance, Thailand, okay, that I'm more familiar with. They are worried because they have the same trends as China. There is, of course, Japan, okay, and the I think most of the countries in Southeast Asia, like Vietnam and Indonesia and Thailand, had very, very successful. It's not just China. Um, 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 reproductive health programs. Okay. In fact, even the Philippines at this point in time, which had such a very strong Catholic Church lobby against reproductive health measures, in fact, its fertility rates have been going slightly down. No? So basically, I just wanted to say that this is something that is now a common problem throughout, or let me just say that it's both a problem and opportunity throughout Asia, East Asia at this point in time.
Julio, you're muted.
Yeah, now the question for Junju, that's the last question that we have.
Oh, okay. I just typed in the chat room. Go
ahead.
Hi, Dr. Bello. Thank you for your talk. My question is, when you mention about all the causes for Belt and Road Initiative, it's convenient to say that it's caused by the overcapacity problem in China. But as Julio mentioned, and you know that overcapacity has been a long-term concern in China. And so far, actually, the empirical evidence does not suggest that the BRI has actually addressed the overcapacity problem in China. So my question is more along this line. If this BRI doesn't really solve overcapacity, and given sometimes the popular, with all the changes in the governments, with the elections in the global south, in the BRI countries, how do you think about the future of BRI? Do you think that's going to be a viable project, let's say in the next 5 or even 10 years, or is it going to be something that it mostly stays on paper? That's my question. Thank you.
Hi, Dr. Sun Tzu. Yes, we were in a common event just 2 months ago, and thanks for that question. Yes, I fully agree that although it was meant to address the overcapacities, it hasn't yet been able to do that. But my sense is that in many ways, although in terms of strict economic viability, the BRI is not living up to expectations, I think that what China has done is because it has used the BRI as a banner, as its banner to, in terms of its push for global leadership. It has created tremendous expectations, that in so many countries in the global south that are now basically trying to work with state enterprises to get Chinese investment. And sometimes, like in the case of Malaysia, sometimes even provincial state enterprises from China are working against each other, precisely because there's been this. So my own view is that in many ways there has now started a snowballing of expectations, precisely because this has become the leading kind of ideological banner of China. And I think you're definitely right that despite the fact that almost $3 million has been invested in the BRI, in terms of its future, the future is more political, my sense, than economic. And of course, what happens, as we all know, is the more BRI becomes subject to domestic political squabbles, okay, in the recipient countries, you also have China, becoming involved in this, because if there's an election, as you say, and the party that had contracted the BRI loses, and there's a new party, it runs the risk, as it's already done. It happened in a number of countries where the BRI is canceled or the BRI is renegotiated. So it has this possibly also negative effects of embroiling China in a big way in local political conflicts. And I think that's one thing. The other thing is that there has been a recent push by China to get other country investors to come in and pitch in, and I think that is an indication that seen by many that, hey, some have interpreted this as China is losing resources, that it's beginning to pull back, and maybe that's well, the thing is that that China has been regarded as some sort of an inexhaustible piggy bank by so many countries, leaderships, that if you come to think about it, of course, there are limits to what China's resources to be able to be invested. And some people are beginning to say that this push to involve Western investors more is really an indicator that it doesn't have enough resources to be able to follow through on the inflated promises of BRI. I think what the Chinese leadership should do at this point is really to decrease expectations. But this is the big problem. Once you have a banner that is being flown, it's very hard to bring it down. The tendency is just to keep waving it, and that creates more problems. And then in the end, when the expectations are so great and they can't be met, then that's when real problems start. And I think that's really the problem that's being courted by the Chinese leadership and the BRI.
Well, thank you so very much. We have a tradition. We open our microphones now and we applaud. So we should applaud Dr. Bello.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Look out for the next announcement of an event of Science Society online speaker series, okay? So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Walden, again.
Bye-bye.
Great.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.